Speaking of, dumping grounds for assets and things, the team that has been maybe the most aggressive about doing that in the past 2 years is the Utah Jazz. I think we were pretty far apart on the Jazz in our standings. I had them
I mean, I didn't have them in the
lower than you.
bottom. I didn't have them in the bottom five,
No,
but
yeah, and I did, and
yeah.
I don't understand why people don't have them in the bottom five. So you tell me about why you don't think the Jazz are a bottom five team.
Well, I have them as a bottom eight team, so we're not exactly worlds apart here.
No.
I have them slightly slightly better than a couple of teams in the Eastern Conference that you might have as superior records here. But I mean, their front court is really good, as we saw last year. Larry Markkinen, Walker Kessler, and then I guess their draft pick is probably going to start. Taylor Hendricks.
Yeah, I couldn't quite figure out their
Or
starting
no,
lineup
sorry,
because
sorry. John Collins is most likely going to have that third starting spot there. Just
yeah,
completely
that's
forgot about the John Collins trade for a few
but
seconds.
so you think they're going to start John Collins and Lowry Markkinen and Walker Kessler?
Yeah, probably start the season with that.
Like because Lowry has kind of played some three in the past and like defensively can sort of
Well, I
it's
mean
a weird lineup.
that's like three out of their four best players.
Yeah, I
If
mean,
you're
I think
benching
John
if you're benching John Collins, you're benching one of your most talented players, even if it's
I
for fit reasons.
John Collins is, I think, a difficult player to rate right now. Like he just had a pretty awful season. I don't know how good John Collins is, or I don't know how like important it is that you start him. But I think there's a situation where you do. I could also see them starting Agbaji, or they could start Taylor Hendricks
I think they're going to start Agbaji at
at
the
the
two.
two.
Yeah,
Who's their
and
point
then
guard?
Jordan Clarkson.
Jordan Clarkson. Oh yeah. Oh man, this is a funny team. So you got in the backcourt, you got Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, Taylor Horton Tucker, Keontae. They drafted Keontae George.
Yeah,
They also picked up Chris Dunn. They've got Ochai Agbaji, who was the Cavs draft pick last year.
hmm
There's who's the best playmaker of those players?
Jordan Clarkson.
That's not great.
No, but I mean, this is.
I
I
hear a
just
lot of people raving about how Jordan Clarkson improved as a passer last year, and they're right. He did improve as a passer,
mhm.
but it's not hard to improve from like 0 to 1.
Well, I mean, it just depends on what type of scale you're using. If it's a 0 to 1 scale, that's pretty good.
It's an infinite improvement, but
Yeah.
I mean, career high. Well, actually, not quite a career high assist rate, but like definitely a big bump in assists from the last several years. But the turnovers went right up with it. He was just put in that playmaker role, and yeah, he made some impressive reads. But this is not a high level playmaker in the NBA at all. This is
No,
still
they. I agree. They don't have one guy who's like a singular playmaking hub and is awesome at it. But I think that with the Jazz, there's a little bit of Celtics to them, where everyone's kind of passing, and the ball is just moving around, and like no one is necessarily like their go-to playmaker for every single set play down the court, but like at the same time, like the ball is going to be moving pretty well with almost everyone they're putting out there, maybe with
see.
the exception of Collins.
I strongly disagree because I think everyone is remembering what the Utah Jazz looked like over the first half of the season before they traded away a lot of their players. And that was absolutely true then. And they were, they stormed out to being like, well over 500. And even up to the trade deadline, they were still like hovering around 500. And then they traded Mike Conley. And,
You don't think that's
um,
more of a coaching decision than a personnel decision?
well, I think they traded away their best playmaker and also one of their best defenders, and they got bad at offense and defense after that. Like they have so many finishers in Utah, And so I know that Mike Conley's not the most important player in the world, but he was someone generating playmaking. And after that, they
Yeah.
had absolutely no ability to play make, and their offense tanked. Lauri Markkanen is a really great offensive player, but he's a great offensive player because he's one of the best finishers in the NBA. He's not a playmaker. He does not initiate the offense. Like, you want him running to the rim, attacking closeouts, dunking on people, and banging threes. I think this is a really bad fit around him this year, again, with so little passing in that lineup. And I don't think Jordan Clarkson is up to the task, and I don't think Colin Sexton is up to the task. And like, there's just a pretty big gap, unless like Chris Dunn is somehow going to be part of the rotation or something like that. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm worried. I think they're going to be. I think people look at this team and they're like, "Oh, this was a top 10 offense last year." It's like, well, it was a top 5 offense for the first half of the season, and then it was like a bottom 10 offense in the second half of the season. I think that bottom 10 offense is more what we're going to end up looking at for the whole season this year. Because again, John Collins, another finisher type, like it's just there's a lot of duplicity of skill set where you have all these attacking guards who don't necessarily pass at a high level, and all these finishing, sort of forwards who aren't going to be initiated for. And Taylor Hendricks doesn't solve that either. Keontae George is in that same kind of Jordan Clarkson category, or it's like there might be some more impressive playmaking chops in there, but we mostly know him as like an attacking scoring guard. He might also not be able to crack the rotation in his rookie season because there's a lot of similar players ahead of him. I'm like pretty pessimistic on Utah's offensive fit this
Yeah.
year, even after what we saw from
Well,
last year.
I guess best case scenario, I see them as kind of like, you know, what the Celtics were doing last year, what the Clippers do when Kawhi isn't on the floor, and I suppose when Russell Westbrook isn't on the floor, given that he's now on the roster now, where it's a bunch of guys where none of them are necessarily great passers individually, but they do keep the ball moving.
Yeah, but I mean the Clippers, like, they had guys like Nick Batum and stuff. I just don't see anyone fitting that definite. Like, I don't know who the best passer on the Jazz is, and if you say it's Jordan Clarkson, I think that's a problem.
Yeah,
Considering if you got like one guy who's like a okay passer and with a whole bunch of guys who are like basically non-passers. Like, they tried
yeah.
Taylor Horton Tucker at a point guard a lot late in the season, and he's like,
It might be Kelly Olynyk.
Kelly Olynyk's their best passer, yeah. And then with John Collins, how much you're going to be able to play Kelly Olynyk? I think they're going to be looking to trade him, but I do think it's going to be one of those seasons where it's just like Kelly Olynyk has to be on the floor, or like the Jazz can only perform offensively with this really specific lineup involving Kelly Olynyk.
Yeah,
I love the front court. Like Walker Kessler and Lauri Markkanen is a really cool front court, and John Collins and Taylor Hendricks are exciting pieces to add to that. But I think where they really coalesced at the beginning of the season last year as like a team that just surprisingly fit together because they had shooting and they had passers and they had finishers. Now they don't have all those things. And I think there's going to be a bit more of like a disconnect. I will say, like, Will Hardy's a really good offensive coach, and he's
yeah,
really good at mixing in a ton of different kinds of actions. So I think they could surprise you. Like, for a pessimist like me, they could just surprise by how many kind of like little sneaky things they're sort of able to do. But I don't like the fit just looking at a roster construction point. So I think it will be all the more impressive if Will Hardy's able to make them perform a little bit more like you're thinking, or like how you're describing them, where it's just like there's sort of the way they run plays creates more offensive lube than necessarily the personnel would suggest.
yeah. I mean, they might surprise us a little bit next year. Ultimately, I had them finishing in the bottom 8 or 9 teams. I
Yeah.
still had them outside of the play-in looking in. So I'm not too much higher on their chances next year than you are.
I think they like have a low key chance to be like in the bottom 3 though.
Yeah, I mean, especially if they want to move that direction, intentionally make some lineup decisions or trade decisions. Some people have speculated that John Collins is not a long-term option for the roster, and he's more of a play him the first half of the season and then flip him for more than you gave Atlanta.
But that's a pretty low bar to get over.
Yeah,
He got traded to Utah for nothing. The contract is so big. I think he'd have to really, really blow up to to interest a team.
Are there any contenders that just have bad contracts on the books that are, sizable enough to move for a guy like John Collins this season, though?
Yeah, that's I can't. I
I mean,
mean,
the
the
Clippers.
Clippers.
Clippers are always the easy option for this question.
Yeah. The how the Warriors already got rid of Jordan Poole, so unless they were like trying to get off Clay or something like that. After that, it gets kind of dicey. It's like,
okay, if Harden doesn't get traded to the Clippers, maybe Utah comes calling.
oof. I'm glad we're not talking about the Sixers in this podcast.
Yeah.
I'm glad we've saved them for the purgatory
Speaking
one.
of teams that just need like functional players to fill out a rotation, the Sixers fit that category. But
I mean, I wouldn't have hated if they'd landed John Collins and put him next to Embiid, but
yeah,
if they're not, if they aren't replacing Harden with more than that, I mean, it's just a little bit concerning.
yes, John Collins isn't good or bad enough to fit Daryl Morey's ideal team building style.
That is very true. He does not make those little solid moves. But no, we're not talking about. I refuse to talk about Philly any more than we currently have. We put them in purgatory for a reason.
We always get roped back into Philly.
Yeah. Any other Utah thoughts? I think like it's definitely an interesting collection of players.
Yeah. I mean, Keontae George looked good in Summer League. I'm still worried about him. I mean, it was a lot of people loved his college season for some reason. I'm not sure why. He was one of the worst efficiency on ball scorers in college basketball last year.
Yeah.
It was bad. I mean, when he made the shots that he was taking, they looked impressive because there was so little space between him and the defender, and he was falling away and he was pirouetting off of 1 foot. And like he made a lot of high degree of difficulty shots last year, but he also generated a lot of high degree of difficulty shots for himself. I don't know. This is a guy who could really benefit from a functional NBA offense and spacing, or it just could be rough for him. So I don't know with Keontae George. I'm not going to pay much attention to summer league results, though. That's for sure.
I mean, we have to accept that in terms of on the fan and media level, a lot of draft hype is like your highlight reel.
Yeah.
Like there's scouts who are watching full games. There's scouts who are doing good draft analysis and showing strengths and weaknesses. And at least like, for the sort of secondhand draft analysts, they're at least looking at quality tape to make a decision. But the vast majority of people are like Keontae George's highlight reel is it rules.
It's
like,
awesome.
You just see crazy shot making, really strong passing ability. Like sometimes like he definitely shows some vision and there's like some potential there, but yeah, once you sort of watch all the shots that he misses alongside that makes you understand a little bit more about his game. But I still think he's I think he's a great draft pick for Utah. I think like he's got a lot of potential.
For a comp, I would just describe him as like a slightly smaller Benedict Mathurin, who's a little bit better as a playmaker.
I mean, I think he's got better handles than Mathurin. I get what you mean, and like he's kind of like this voracious kind of
just like a physical shot taker guard who like scores more with toughness than and like determination than he does with like getting separation from his defender.
Yeah. The lack of ability to generate separation is what kind of had him tumbling down my draft board, and I think lots of other people's. But I'm also not a big Eggs Benny fan, so.
Also, Taylor Hendricks, we didn't talk about him, top 10 pick. One of the most exciting defensive prospects, in my mind, from this draft class. With the size, 6'9", and the lateral speed, and I don't know.
I mean, because I guess that's the other angle we could take with Utah. Is like, what if actually they use Taylor Hendricks a lot with Walker Kessler and generate a plucky, surprising defense? I think that's maybe a more path for them to be a little bit better than expected, or a little bit better than I'm expecting. But it's like, it's because, what if it's like Ochai Agbaji, Taylor Hendricks, and Walker Kessler all in the starting lineup, rather than it being like Sexton and Clarkson, with Bryce Sensabaugh or something like that. Because there's another, they did pretty well in this draft in terms of like names that people were excited about. There's a lot of interesting rookies coming in there.
Yeah, no, definitely. I really like Hendricks a lot, and I really like Sensabaugh end of the first round for a guy who has that
Yeah,
much offensive talent. Like who knows? He's another injury yellow or orange flag guy. He had like
yeah,
a bad injury coming out of high school, I believe. But um, yeah, I mean, we'll see. I'm not. That's not necessarily a guy that you want to count on doing much this season, but
there is a fierce level of competition in Utah, maybe the fiercest level of competition for who gets to be the chucker off the bench.
yeah,
Like we got, like Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, Taylor Horton Tucker, Keontae George, Bryce Sensabaugh, all, even throw John Collins in there possibly. Like, whichever one of these group doesn't start, it's a long list for who gets to be the bench chucker. I feel like they kind of built this house out of bench chuckers a little bit.
Olynyk as well. I mean, he averaged almost 13 points a game last year.
Yeah,
He's
yeah,
gonna
that's true. But I
get some
think
shots
with
up.
Olynyk, at least you come in and he's expected to be more of a kind of like Olynyk's always been pure offensive lube. He just comes in and
Yeah,
it's combination of sort of like playmaking with enough shooting and scoring threat that he just can like kind of do whatever and make things
yeah.
easier for his
He
teammates.
shoots. He makes the right pass. He has those like really awkward big white guy drives to the rim
Yeah,
sometimes that
yeah,
just that work. It looks terrible, but the ball goes in. Yeah, I don't know.
yeah.
I've
I
always
mean,
I've always liked Olynyk as he's always been a good offensive player, and just for whatever reason he bounces around the NBA a lot. He's never really found a
yeah.
long term home.
There's definitely a different version of his career where he finds a more solid long-term home and is just like his job is to unlock offensive lineups. Instead, he's done it in high profile ways in Boston, Miami, but it's crazy that he's already 31 and just feels like he's already at that stage in his career. And still doing the same thing quietly. Like people just sort of like forget that he has never really stopped being like pretty good. Like, remember when he went to Houston a couple years back and was just like,
Yeah,
putting up like 19 points per game or whatever, and just sort of like, I don't know, like 19 and like 4 assists. It's just sort of like, who is this man? Um,
well, I
so
mean, people forget, but he was one of the earlier, like really highly touted prospects out of Gonzaga.
yeah,
Um, because Gonzaga for a long time was in this stage where like there were always this team that was like okay in the March Madness, and they would secure like a 5 or 6 seed and they'd win a round or two, and then they got to this next level where they're actually recruiting NBA talent. And Kelly Olynyk was within kind of the first wave of that. International player out of Canada, and
yeah,
Gonzaga was kind of leading the way towards college basketball's revolution, where they're also scouting and recruiting international talent, just like the professional leagues had been.
yeah. I guess you're right because he was a few years before Sabonis.
Hmm.
And before that, I mean, you go back to like Adam Morrison, like he was a top 3 pick or whatever, but it was
Yeah,
a
but
bunch
he
of
he
more kind
was
of,
not a NBA talent coming out of high school. He was a
yeah, that's true.
surprise.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. When I think of Gonzaga, like I think of like, uh, or like obviously John Stockton, but then like going for like I remember like do you remember Dan Dickow? Like that was like
Hmm.
that was the quintessential Gonzaga guy for me for a while before they became a little bit more of a sort of like prospect powerhouse. Just like they're gonna have like a plucky cerebral player who's like something might get drafted but not really, and I don't know.
Yeah,
Robert Sacra, there's another
Lakers
Canadian big.
legend.
Yeah. And a lot of Canadians keep going to Gonzaga.
Hmm.
It's
Well, we're
Linux, Sacra, and Brandon Clark.
we're close by.
Yeah.